My roommate went completely insane after I rejected him and threatened my life when I tried to report him. On the day I met my college roommate, Tom, he mentioned how he liked to avoid the cracks on the sidewalk, not to avoid bad luck, but because he believed each crack contained a tiny universe, and stepping on them would destroy that universe and all its inhabitants. Tom also carried around a rubber stamp, approving or rejecting people's outfits by stamping their hands, claiming to be the fashion police. He even kept a lawn chair in the shower, insisting that sitting was the luxurious way to bathe. But perhaps the oddest quirk was his use of a small megaphone to order food at drive-thrus, claiming it ensured clear communication. One day, Tom asked me out by giving me a 3D printed model of a human heart, then wheezed out the words, "You stole my heart," before collapsing dramatically on the floor. I rejected him, and from that point on, his behavior changed drastically. Tom, who had always been clean and orderly, suddenly began piling his belongings in a chaotic mess in the corner of our living room. At first, I thought it was just dirty laundry, but the pile grew into a mix of clean clothes, literal dirty dishes, old textbooks, and bizarrely enough, food wrappers with half-eaten food still inside. The smell soon became unbearable. When I tried to address the mess casually, hoping he'd take the hint, Tom just shrugged it off, claiming he was too caught up with his studies to clean. But even on weekends, he would walk right past the pile, sometimes adding to it when the trash can was directly in the kitchen, which he didn't help take out. Tom even dropped all of his goofy antics, something I had learned to appreciate over time. As the semester progressed, so did the gravity of Tom's habits. He began leaving food out for days, not just packaged snacks, but open cans of beans, half-eaten takeout, you name it, everything was left to rot openly on the kitchen counter. When I confronted him about the smell and the critters it attracted, he laughed it off and told me to chill. I asked him if this was really all because I rejected him, but he stayed silent, refusing to answer. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, he started making weird passes at me whenever I brought friends over. He'd make jokes about their bodies or weird comments about our looks just loud enough for us to hear. He even made a joke about getting intimate with us. As a joke, it was embarrassing and made me feel unsafe. My friends stopped visiting, and I felt bad for having to deal with that alone. One weekend, I came back from a study group to find Tom throwing a massive party in our apartment. He hadn't told me anything about the party, and I obviously didn't agree to it. The place was packed, the music was deafening, and my personal belongings were being tossed around by these drunk strangers. I snatched back my things from the living room and locked myself in my room. The chaos was too much. When I tried to look through my backpack, which was being tossed around like a beach ball, I saw that my study notes were trashed, my clothes were stained with drinks, and the apartment was a disaster area. I confronted Tom the next morning, but he just rolled his eyes and told me that it was just a party that was the last straw. I decided to report Tom to the university housing office. I told them everything: the mess, the food, the parties, and his behavior. The housing staff seemed sympathetic, and I left the office feeling a bit relieved and hopeful that things might change. But when Tom found out, he was furious. He cornered me in the kitchen, accusing me of trying to ruin his life and demanding I take back my complaint form. He threatened to make my life even more miserable if I didn't. I was scared of what he might do to me as he towered over me. I called the housing office the next day and told them that I'd exaggerated the report due to stress from schoolwork. But as expected, taking the complaint back was the worst thing I could have done. His behavior only grew more bizarre and disturbing. He started keeping jars filled with his nail clippings and strands of hair in the bathroom, as if trying to get back at me for even thinking about going to the university's office. One afternoon I came back from my classes to a foul smell from the kitchen. It was a familiar aroma by now, but this time it was somehow worse, more intense. That's when I noticed them. They were eggs that Tom had taken out of the fridge weeks ago to cook, but never bothered to put back, just sitting there on the counter with no intention of being moved. Over the next month, those eggs looked like a science experiment. I watched each day as maggots began to form inside the shells, and soon gnats started to surround the egg carton. The sight was nauseating, and the smell even worse. Eventually, I approached Tom about the decomposing eggs, telling him how unhealthy it was to live like this, and asking if he could throw them out. His reaction was chilling. He said no, and if I even thought about touching them, I'd regret it. I backed down, realizing that challenging him might only escalate the situation further. Tom's behavior had gotten worse in ways I couldn't have predicted. During our spring break, he invited a group of his friends to stay at our apartment for what was supposed to be just a weekend. That weekend stretched into almost a full week, and with each day that passed, I felt even more uncomfortable around them. His friends were an eclectic bunch, to say the least. They had the same careless attitude as Tom, leaving dishes piled high in the sink, spilling food on the counters without bothering to clean it up, and turning the living room into their personal landfill. The odor of unwashed clothes and stale food became the apartment's regular smell unless I cleaned it up. The apartment was almost unbearable to stay in, especially in the common areas. One evening, as I was about to go to sleep early, I headed to my room to escape the boys, and there was a knock at my door. It was one of Tom's friends, a tall guy with a smile so wide it looked sinister. He looked past me and said my room looked really cozy. I said thanks and tried to shut the door, but in that instant he put his foot in the door and asked if he could crash in there with me. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, complimenting my room and saying I had really great taste. He mentioned how it looked way cleaner in my room than it did in the common area. I told him that I needed my space and that they had the living room. He flashed that wide smile again, saying, "No worries, and just hope to sleep next to a pretty girl that night." I closed the door and tried to go to sleep, but they were too loud. Eventually they quieted down enough that I could drift off, but the unsettling nature of his words lingered. What happened the next day was far worse. One long afternoon, while Tom's friends were sprawled across the living room, I decided I couldn't take the mess any longer. I began cleaning up around them, dirty dishes piled on the coffee table, empty snack wrappers tossed carelessly on the floor, and half-empty soda cans teetering on the edge of surfaces. As I bent over to pick up a grimy pizza box, one of Tom's friends, who had been watching TV, glanced over and chuckled, "Look at her doing all the wife duties for us." "I may have to put a ring on it," he joked, nudging the guy next to him, who laughed and nodded in agreement. Their words hung in the air, heavy with a mocking tone that made my skin crawl, but I chose to ignore them, keeping my focus on cleaning. I could feel my blood beginning to boil on the inside. Here I was, cleaning up after grown men who seemed to think my efforts were part of some performance for them. Late one evening, I was about to go to the kitchen to find something edible that hadn't been contaminated by Tom and his crew. I could hear them laughing and talking in the living room. Outside my door, I could hear Tom saying that he had dibs on me first. I could tell he was joking, or at least I hoped he was. The group burst into laughter, and another voice chimed in. It was the guy from the night before. He doubted that I would give any of them a chance, and decided to make a bet with the group to see who could hit first before they left. His words sent a chill down my spine. The suggestion was met with more laughter and sounds of agreement. They treated me like a part of their game, making me sick to my stomach. I was horrified. They made me feel like prey. Where was the goofy and quirky guy I met on my first day of moving in with him? Was he really that upset about me rejecting him? I had lost my appetite and decided to stay in my room. I locked the door and pushed my dresser against it for good measure. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I broke out into a cold sweat across my forehead. I knew I wouldn't get much sleep that night. I couldn't even go to the university housing office to file another complaint, because they were out for the holiday. I couldn't call the police because what would I tell them? Arrest these guys because they made me feel uncomfortable with no proof beyond my word. And I knew that if I told on Tom, he would continue making my life a living hell. That night, the apartment felt more like a prison than ever. Every noise felt like a potential threat. Every laugh or shout made me jump. I stayed awake, lights off, sitting against my bed with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I texted my friend about what was happening, and they offered to come and get me, but the thought of walking out past them in the middle of the night was too terrifying to consider, especially after how Tom treated my girlfriends before. I could only imagine what his friends would do to them. As the hours dragged on, the sounds from the living room eventually faded as they fell asleep one by one, but I still wasn't comfortable going to bed yet. By the time dawn broke, my eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, and my body was tense from hours of fear. The next morning I packed a small bag with essentials and waited for a moment when the apartment was quiet. As soon as I heard the last snore fade away, I slipped out of my room. I unlocked the front door and slipped out without a sound. I didn't return until I got a text from Tom later that day simply reading, "They're gone." The message was supposed to bring relief, but all it did was remind me of how unsafe I felt and how deeply Tom had betrayed my trust by allowing and encouraging their behavior. One evening I came back to wash my clothes and continue staying with my friends for a while. When I got back to the apartment, I found a new addition to his collection of horrors, a small jar containing what looked like teeth. I couldn't tell if they were human or animal, but that sight was the final nail in the coffin. I couldn't live like this anymore. I was determined to put an end to this, so I started gathering evidence. I took photos and videos of the apartment's condition and his bizarre collections and recorded audio of his late-night rants and parties. It took weeks, but I carefully documented everything. I wanted to make sure I had undeniable proof of the living hell I was going through. One Wednesday afternoon, I knew that Tom was going to have a 3-hour lab, so I decided it was the perfect time to gather more evidence from his room. I slipped into his room, phone in hand, ready to document every bizarre and disturbing detail. The room was a horror show, dirty laundry piled high in one corner, old food containers stacked in another, and the infamous jars of nail clippings lined up on a shelf, each labelled by date. I began taking pictures, the camera shutter sound muffled by my thumb pressing firmly on the speaker. I moved carefully, making sure everything was left exactly as I had found it to avoid any suspicion. As I was crouched down, photographing a particularly mouldy sandwich that had been left on the floor, I heard the front door of the apartment swing open with a creak that spiked my heart rate instantly. Panic surged through me. Tom was home. The lab must have ended sooner than expected, or maybe he skipped it altogether. My mind raced as I scrambled to think of an excuse for being in his room. I quickly tucked my phone away and stood up, trying to look as casual as possible. I straightened a few items on his desk, pretending to be tidying up a bit, something he knew I did compulsively in the shared spaces, hoping this would cover my real intentions. Tom's footsteps approached. I held my breath, praying he would head straight to the kitchen or bathroom first. Fortunately, the universe was on my side for once, and I heard the fridge door open, and then the familiar sound of him rummaging through it. Seizing the moment, I slipped out of his room just as quietly as I had entered. I closed the door with the faintest click and made my way to the living room, picking up a book from the coffee table and trying to appear engrossed in it as Tom finally came into view. He jokingly asked if I was doing some spring cleaning, and I told him that I was just keeping busy, trying to sound less nervous. He let it go and went to his room. I breathed a sigh of relief. I finally had everything I needed. Armed with my evidence, I went back to the housing office. This time I was adamant that I wouldn't be swayed into retracting my complaint. I laid out everything from the photos of the rotting food to the recordings of his unsettling comments. The housing office was horrified. They acted swiftly this time. Within days, an official inspection was conducted, and Tom was found in violation of multiple housing policies. The evidence was overwhelming, and finally Tom was escorted out of the apartment by campus security. I was moved to a new dorm room, one where I had no roommate. The university apologized for not taking more immediate action and assured me that they would review their policies on handling such complaints. Looking back, I learned a lot about standing up for myself. It was a nightmare scenario, but enduring it and fighting back taught me about resilience. I'm in a better place now, literally and figuratively. I've since focused on my studies and am looking forward to a peaceful rest of my academic career.